You can't divide the world into piles and say everyone who is heterosexual should have a child and everyone who's gay or single or married has to be child-free.
Yeah.
What makes sense is, who am I as a person? If I'm in a relationship, how are we in a relationship? And does having a child appeal to us or not? So it's all part of that reproductive freedom.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Let me tell you, I have the most perfect guest for you today. I am so excited to bring you today's conversation, and this one is extra special to me for a few different reasons. Now, first of all, this is somebody who is a very busy woman, and it's taken some coordination for us to have this conversation, but alas, it has happened, and that means I get to bring it to you today, and I was so grateful when she said yes to coming on the podcast. Second of all, this is someone who is a professional mentor to me. It is someone who I have been learning from because she's been doing this decision-making work around the kids or child-free decision for a very long time now, which you will hear about in just a moment. And third of all, just because she's someone who's been doing this for so long, she has such incredible wisdom to share. She has so much experience. She is one of the original decision-making coaches and mentors and therapists on this decision of whether to have kids or stay child-free. And who is she? She is none other than Merle Bombardieri, who is the author of The Baby Decision: How to Make the Most Important Choice of Your Life. Merle is a psychotherapist and decision coach who specializes in parenthood decision-making, and her writing has appeared in Brides, Glamour, Self, the Boston Globe magazine, Boston Magazine, and Our Bodies Ourselves. Merle has also written medical journal articles and even a chapter in a medical textbook. She has lectured at Harvard Medical School, MIT, Wellesley College, and the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. Merle has appeared on national radio and television news shows, talk shows, and documentaries, and she has been quoted in many publications, including Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Huffington Post. Merle, I am so excited to have you on, and we have so much to talk about today. I can already say, without having spoken very much in depth with you, that we'll probably have to have you back onto the podcast in future because you are such a fountain of knowledge and experience. So let's just get right into it. Why don't you just, in case people don't know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, my name is Merle Bombardieri. I'm a clinical social worker and an author. I'm the author of The Baby Decision. I have been doing this work on parenthood decision making for about 45 years. So I've been doing it for a very long time. I am a parent of two daughters, one of whom is child-free and one of whom has one child. I've been an advocate for child-free people since 1978. So even though I'm a mother, it's been a really important part of my work. I really think reproductive freedom means that anybody that wants to be a parent can be, and everyone that doesn't want to shouldn't have to be. So that's really what I've devoted my career to. And The Baby Decision has been out for many years. The most recent edition was 2016, but I'm writing a new book also on this topic, which is going to look at some of the newer, hotter topics such as the environment and millennials' terror of pregnancy and childbirth and postpartum, and everyone's concern about couples being equal, with the workloads.
Yeah. Well, I know we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but I am curious, of course. 45 years is an incredible amount of time to be dedicated to this profession. And there are, as you and I both know and have talked about, relatively few people globally who really specialize in this decision. And you are one of them. And
you're another one of them who does a beautiful
you.
job. So I'm so honored to be here with you. And I'm so glad that you sought me out for us to work together with some learning and mentoring. It's just a joy.
Yeah. No, I'm super grateful for it. And for me to be able to learn from you and for you to be on the podcast today is certainly an honor. I've had requests to have you on, and I just want to say, and I know you're going to want to purchase the book if you haven't already read it, and we'll talk about it today. But if you have not read The Baby Decision and you are struggling with this decision, which I presume you are if you're listening to this podcast, you must pick up a copy, and you'll want to make sure that you are attuned to everything that Merle has going on for when the new book comes out. So, okay. So tell me, now I want to mostly talk about how our listeners can make this decision, but as is customary for all of our guests, you are a mom. I'm interested to know, was this was it an active decision for you? Was this something that you just knew you would do, or was it something that you struggled with? Can you speak to that briefly?
Sure. I was not someone who grew up playing with dolls and knew I wanted to be a
Mm,
mother. I'm not like a lot of child-free women who've always known that they wanted to be child-free. It was just kind of a neutral topic to me.
hmm
And my husband proposed to me, and I said no, even though I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. I'm Jewish. I come from a quiet Jewish family. I was thinking about going to graduate school and having an academic career. I had just spent a summer with very, very spoiled 12-year-old campers in Michigan.
mm,
And so that combination, my favorite time of night at camp was after the campers were in bed. So I just wasn't at all sure if I wanted to have a child. And Rocco comes from a large family. There were 6 children in the family, lots of children and grandchildren. And children and family was just such a big part of their lives. And I couldn't see depriving him of that, but I couldn't promise that I would be willing
mhm,
to do it. And it was very interesting because he assumed that because I loved him, at some point within a marriage, it would just automatically occur to me that I wanted to have a child and children. And I said,
yeah.
we can't know that. And it was kind of like an assumption. This was just at the beginning of the 70s
Mm,
feminist movement, but it was an assumption if you have uterus and you have breasts and you love your husband, then you're going to have children. And that just wasn't true for me. So we actually spent about a year and a half of time during which we had a lot of long dialogues about parenthood, about whether we wanted to get married or not. And during that time, I got clinical experience with an emotionally disturbed autistic girl. And I also worked in a daycare center with just everyday preschoolers. But probably what was most crucial to me in that whole process, besides just the fact that Rocco's and my conversations together were so rich and so deep and really helped us get to know each other, was the role modeling. I worked with a lot of mothers who were either Michigan State faculty or they were in
mhm,
PhD programs. And I asked them, here you are, you're having a career and you have a child. Are you glad you did it? What advice would you have to me in considering whether or not I want to do it? And they all said, right now, life is really crazy. It is really just tiring and a lot of chaos and not a lot of leisure. But having kids and being a family is just so joyful that it feels like it's worth it. And of course, they're getting older and easier and so on. So I really needed those role models of women who were
yeah.
kept their identity, kept their careers, were in advanced careers, and were enjoying children as well. So all of that enabled me to say yes.
Yeah. It's interesting for a lot of reasons. One is I'm very impressed that you and Rocco spent so much time having this conversation with each other. Despite the fact that societally it was a given, and in many ways it still is for women today. And especially I had this conversation with someone else recently, how much it's like it goes hand in hand with marriage, although it shouldn't. Like a lot of people have
Exactly.
that perception. You get married, then you have children. And so for you, it was like, I don't want to accept the proposal unless I know what we're doing on the children front. So the fact that you were able to have these conversations and really make an intentional decision, plus had this view of, like you say, ambitious women who had this identity outside of motherhood, who could see, of course, the challenges that come with motherhood, but also the joys, and sort of impress that upon you. It sounds like you had a really interesting vantage point that allowed you to make that decision. Okay, so I'm interested to know, like, did your own grappling with this decision play into the work you do now, or can you tell us how you landed
It
on this
it
work?
did. Okay, so I will back up and say
Yeah.
I got a master's social work degree from San Diego State between
hmm
74 and 76, and I got pregnant with my older daughter just a couple of months after I got my MSW. So I had been very involved in humanistic psychology, the idea that there's not just one kind of behavior, but that the happiest people are the people who really discover the meaning of their lives, the depth of a relationship. If in a relationship, it's not just, oh, I'm married and these are the roles of married people. It's who am I? Who is my partner? How are we different together than we are as individuals? And just the whole depth of that and the many, many ways it's possible to be happy. And the fact that how we become happy is based a lot on whether or not we're really looking at who we are and what we need and not just going, by roles. So I had all of that in my background. I will just say one more thing. Just in
Yeah.
preparing for meeting, I was looking for a quote that I couldn't quite remember, because I know one of the questions you want to talk about is how can we tell people who are struggling with this decision and it's just painful and awful how something good could come out of it. And I thought of
Yeah.
a Martin Buber quote, and it was something where along the lines of, "Oh, you people who are so secure and you walk on solid ground, but you're just doing things rote." This was about religion. It was about whether you've experienced God personally or just, doing all the right prayers, etc. So it's a little off the
Yeah.
subject, but it's not off the subject because basically what he's saying is we who hang by our heels over the precipice and look at the terror, we live a richer life because we're
Yeah.
willing to not know, we're willing to be scared, and out of that, we can form our own sense of well-being and including spirituality and life choices. So yes, it's harder if you look at the pain. If you just, flip a
Yeah.
coin and are going to be child free or flip a coin and have a child, it's easier. But that pain is part of a process that makes you happy as a child free person or happy as a parent and makes you experience your partner if you're in a relationship in such a deep way that even if it's painful and even if you're disagreeing on the
Yeah.
choice, there's a lot of wonderful stuff that come out of it.
Yeah. It's, I always joke with my clients when they're in the thick of it because I think it's probably the last thing they want to hear, although it's the thing they need to hear, is that there really is a super big critical upside of being stuck on this decision. And that is the ability to live intentionally, to really create the kind of fulfilling life that's right for you, as opposed to just following a script or kind of, even if you, of course, end up having children, which is what the script often denotes, to know that you're going into it with your eyes wide open saying, I choose this, is so powerful. And I do think that it helps bring fulfillment to other areas of life way beyond this question, to your point, in your partnership, in your life, broadly speaking. And so I'm curious for you, would you say you having really, sat with Rocco and yourself to evaluate this question, do you think it brought you more contentment and fulfillment in parenthood because you evaluate it so closely?
I think that was probably true. I guess I'm just going to back up and say in my new
Mm,
book and just in my coaching, I'm really
yeah.
emphasizing that child free should be the default rather than
Okay.
everyone assuming that everyone's going to have kids. And maybe some people who really don't want to have kids are going to break with that and, and decide to be child free. We should start with the assumption that the default, the normal thing for people to do, individuals or couples, in terms of reproductive identity and choice, is to be
Yeah.
child free, and that you have to rule out a good child free life before you decide to have a child. It can't
Yeah.
be, I'm doing this because everybody else is doing it, or it's because it's what's expected of me. It has to be, these are the things that excite me about parenthood, and these are the reasons that I would consider doing it.
Yeah, I like that. Seeing it as an opting in rather than an opting out, seeing the child free status, if you will, as that's kind of the baseline. And then we can decide to add something. And I don't mean that life is better necessarily, but the addition of children versus saying, I'm not going to have children. I think that's a really good assumption to work with. To set up this conversation, I'd love if you would share something that you wrote at the beginning of the book. And I don't know why this just struck me so profoundly when I read it, but I thought, wow, this is really interesting because let's just say, and it's in the podcast name, kids or child free. This is how we look at this decision that I'm going to have kids or stay child free, regardless of what we see as the default. And you said there are, in fact, 6 different choices or sort of decision arcs that we can take around this decision. And I'm wondering if you would just briefly outline what those are, because I think it may help people identify sort of where they're at versus where they might be aiming to be.
Okay, well, in order to talk about the 6 decisions, I really have to talk about Abraham Maslow and the
Mm,
idea of growth decisions versus safety decisions. A growth decision is a decision that you make because you think that the results will enable you to grow, even if there's fear, even if there's pain. A safety
hmm
decision is a decision you make because you you don't want to take a risk. Now, this is
Yeah.
very important. We have to look at this very carefully politically, because it's very easy for people who are pronatalist, including parents who are happiest parents and want their loved ones to have kids, whether they want to have them or not, to say, well, of course, the growth decision is to have a kid because it will upset your life. You're scared of it. You'll do it. You'll get through it, and you will be a grown up. And to say that the safety decision is to be child free. But none of this is true. The only question you could ask is which is a growth decision and which is a safety decision for you. So I know people who decided to have a child because the woman was unhappy with her job, the couple was bored. They didn't have to go through the pain of deciding to quit a job, and they got pregnant, and they just fell into it, and it solved a problem, and it was really the safety decision and not the growth decision for them. Once they became parents, there were ways that they grew, but it wasn't originally a growth decision. And people who want to be child free, it is so often a growth decision because they have to deal with so much criticism and rejection, whether even if family and friends are supportive, society is not supportive. And very often family and friends, even when they want the best for someone who wants to be child free, because they themselves have enjoyed parenting, they don't want their loved one to miss it. And they have trouble understanding that what made them happy really isn't right for them. So it's a tremendous amount of growth to make a decision that defies society, that brings criticism from family and friends, and raises the question of FOMO, what am I missing out on? Who will be with me when I'm old, and so on. So we can't talk about either decision being growth or safety by itself. It's in the context of what is a growth decision and safety decision for me. And it's also complicated by the fact that if we're talking about a couple, there can be something that would be the ideal growth decision for one member of the couple. The ideal growth decision might be the other decision for the couple. So what is the growth decision for us as a couple?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, effectively, when we're looking at these three growth decisions, it's really looking at like enacting a choice, like actually consciously deciding whether that's choosing to be child free, choosing to be a parent, or you also say choosing to postpone the decision as another kind of growth decision.
Yes. So I'm going to start with with postponement decision. So if people just don't make a decision, I call that, if they're going to be child free drift. They just say, well, maybe we'll have kids, maybe we won't. And they just never say it. They never make an actual decision. But to postpone with goals is different. If we say, we're going to postpone for the next 3 years until we finish our education, maybe we've named 2 or 3 problems in our relationship. We'd like our communication to be better. Maybe one or both of us don't know very much about children. So we're going to name the specific goals. Maybe we want to live in a different country or a different part of the country. So setting very specific goals, a date to have a deadline to talk about it, to take stock, and specifics about how are we going to do it? How are we going to improve our relationship? That might be seeing a couples counselor or going to a weekend couple workshops. How are we going to figure out if we know whether we can afford to have a child? Let's keep good financial records and let's talk to a financial planner. All of those things. So that is a responsible way of doing it. So the idea of the growth decisions is that you take responsibility for yourself. You're willing to take a risk. You're willing that you might be wrong, but you're going to declare what you want. So that can be a decision to have a child. It can be a decision to be child free. It can be a decision to postpone. The non-decisions or the safety decisions are to have the non-accidental accident. And we've seen this so much in people. Let's say they are in their late 30s, and maybe they've been together since they were 20, and they have used contraceptives perfectly for all of those years, and all of a sudden, during the 4 months that they're going crazy trying to make a decision, whoops, they have an accidental pregnancy. So they're just, being less careful or just kind of being wishy-washy and vague about the whole thing. And the problem with that is that when difficulties come during pregnancy and during parenthood, it can be a feeling like, oh, unlucky us, we hadn't really decided, but we had an accident. When you make a specific decision, you are really connected to why it matters to you. And one woman that I work with, and she's been public with this online, so I can tell a little bit of the story. She and her husband attended a workshop that I did, and they very consciously decided to have a child. Then they ran into infertility. Then they ran into, I believe, a miscarriage. And then their child was born early and had to be in the ICU. And they told me that every point of the difficulty, because they had made a conscious decision, they saw all of this, even the disappointments and the problems, as part of their grand plan to become parents. And because they knew that, they could still feel lucky and they could still feel in control.
Yeah.
So that's a problem with the, not trying, not preventing.
Yeah, I can see how it's sort of like shrugging off accountability too. It's this idea that if things get tough or if you're not that happy with your decision, you can say, well, it's not really my fault or I didn't really ask for this. But it also means you're not really going all in on something as well in the same way, which is not to say that parents who have accidental pregnancies aren't all in, but
Of course.
To attribute it to like, oh, well, it's tempting for people. I'm curious for people listening, just kind of recognize this. Have you ever thought, and hey, I think many people on the fence have thought this, oh, I just wish that circumstances would decide for me. I'm either trying to have a kid and I'm not able to, then it's decided. I have a contraception fail, whatever it may be. We get forgetful because it feels like then you're displacing the decision. You don't necessarily have to make it for yourself. But of course, as you share here, and this is why I love these 6 decisions, it is still a decision to do things that way.
It is. And then there is the what I call child-free drift, which is people who never make a conscious decision. They kind of know or suppose that they're not going to have a child, but they never declare it. And they can feel like, if they're conscious of it, they might feel like, well, we're leaving our options open. But I'll tell you what the problem with that is. People who decide that they're going to be child-free are able to recognize they're at that crossroad. They're committing to being child-free. They realize that they may miss out on some things, but they think it's going to be the best life for them. And they're able to really look at what are we able to do because we are not putting our time and money into having a child. That might be a career change, starting a business, becoming an artist. If you're both working 60 hours a week and you've been doing it for years, maybe you decide to travel and take a year off. Maybe, when you met each other, sex was great and you hung out a lot. You had all these long, great conversations. And maybe you haven't done that for the last 5, 6 years. Making a conscious decision to be child-free, you can say, what are the opportunities? What haven't we done yet that we want to have happen? And by the way, that's true with parents too. That's why I love this work, because it's always about who am I, if you're part of a couple, who are we, and what hasn't happened yet that we want to make sure happens between now and when we die. But to consciously decide to be child-free means that you can make really good decisions about squeezing all the best juice out of the child-free life. And so it's much better. And I've heard people say, we talked about being child-free 7 years ago, and sort of now we're kind of looking at it and saying, okay, we're child-free. But if we had made a conscious decision, 7 years ago to be child-free, I could have been through my PhD program, which I'm just starting. Or we had an opportunity to go live in Portugal for a year, and we just kind of ignored it. So there are these opportunities and possibilities that you can just get so much more out of. And also, child-free people are a family of 2. We often think of couple versus family, but child-free couples, a family of 2. Their love, their nurturance for each other, the time they spend together and hang out, and they can get so much more out of that if they've consciously decided to become a child-free couple, ruled out parenthood and said, okay, here we are. How are we going to be together? And of course, that includes adding children, parents, friends, other activities in their lives. But this opportunity to be a family of 2, and many people who choose to be child-free say, we really like the idea of being uninterrupted, that we can hang out and be reading poetry to each other and have a conversation, and not have kids saying, Mommy, I want more water, and Daddy, can you read me this story? So it gives you a chance to get more out of your decision.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think once you make that decision, should you choose to remain child free and to do that with deliberation, there's like really a stepping into something that it's not the same when you're in this kind of holding pattern of like, maybe we'll have kids someday. Even if you're not really grappling with it, thinking that you might eventually have children, I do believe that you act in a different way, because there's always this leaving doors open, not necessarily making the same kind of commitments. You're not thinking in the same kind of way. And I know for Chris and I, that was a big shift that we had to make when we made this decision to remain child free, is not just looking at life as it is with, omission of children, which is fine. We have a great life, but really saying, what else should we choose to? Can we welcome in? Can we gain? Can we choose to explore because we're choosing not to have children? Okay, so I think was that our sixth? Then we have 3 growth decisions: to choose to have a child, to choose not to have a child, and to choose to postpone, but with certain markers along the way.
Right. I think there's another safety decision, the non-decision.
And I'm sorry, we should have
the non-decision to agonize.
Yeah.
So people make themselves suffer, and because they don't want to make a decision that scares them, they just never make a decision.
Yeah. Okay. Chances are, if you're listening to this again, and by the way, I know we have some parents listening, which I love. I know we have some affirmatively child-free people listening, and some people who are taking very proactive steps on their journey. But if you identify with that, the other side, the safety side, you can see through what Merle describes, some of the pitfalls of just sort of being pulled along by life. And really, you do end up in this state of like persistent agony and feeling stuck and discomfort and pain. And so, okay, let's talk about how we can start getting out of it. And one of the questions I want to ask you, because it's so key in a lot of people's minds, is what happens if I'm feeling at odds with my partner on this decision? If I'm in a relationship and we both either want different things, or conversely, maybe you're both ambivalent, like where do we go from there? So what are your suggestions for couples navigating this?
Okay, well, one of the suggestions is not to panic, because a lot of times when people start out disagreeing, they actually find a solution that they can live with. So first of all, don't panic. Secondly, be willing to listen to your partner, even though you may be furious and disappointed, especially if you agreed to have a child or agreed to be child-free when you first met or when you first married, to realize that people change. There are crises, maybe your own threat of terminal illness or a parent dying, or getting experience with a niece or a nephew, or having negative experiences with kids running into your own health problem or whatever, can make someone who thought they knew what they wanted change their mind. So to try to listen and be curious, even though it's a threat. And also, I have this decision maker's bill of rights, and one of them is to realize that you and your partner's opinions on parenthood are just opinions. There's not an absolute truth. So that's very important to recognize.
Yeah.
Another thing that's really useful is to look at, what could I do to make my decision more acceptable to you, and for both people to do that. So let's say a woman wants to have a child, and assuming a straight couple, the man doesn't. We've been, our original idea was to have 3 kids. What if we talked about having just 1 kid, and instead of doing it in the next year or 2, what if we waited 5 years? And some of your questions about whether you want to have a child or not, could be met that way. So, those are some examples. And for someone who is trying to persuade their partner to be child-free, what are the things that you love most or that appeal to you most about having a child? And are there other ways that we can give that to you? So really trying to look at what the possibilities are. Now, if the 2 people are totally polarized, if one of them feels that they could never have a child under any circumstance and would break up with the beloved best partner of their life in order not to have a child, and the other one feels like they were put on earth to have a child, those couples are the ones most likely to break up. But most people are somewhere in between. Most people leaning towards parenthood have lots of worries and fears about having a child, and can see lots of attractions to the child-free choice. A lot of people who are leaning child-free haven't made an absolute decision yet, and they do see some things that they could enjoy about parenthood, particularly if they have a very loving partner who is going to do a lot of nurturing. It may be easier for them to imagine that they actually might enjoy parenting together. So a lot of times it's a matter of looking at what all the possibilities are. It's also very helpful to work with a psychotherapist or a coach who can help you through your blind spots and help you communicate better. But don't assume. that there's
Yeah.
no way to work it out, because most of the time there is. And if you have this fear, we're going to break up and life will be a disaster, I would like to direct you to the Reddit Fence Sitter sub, because there are so many people who tell their stories of breaking up with the love of their lives and how difficult and painful it was. But now they have a partner who's enjoying being child free with them, and their partner is enjoying parenting. And sometimes these couples are friends and get together.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can be friends for life. And so you can land on your feet.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to think about that. The reason I bring it up is that I think when people realize that they are quite polarized, they're so panicked that they can't think about it. They're so desperate, and often it's not even conscious, so you can't think about it or reassure yourself or find out. But the idea that you could be okay even if you break up is a really
Yeah.
important foundation to be able to calmly and with clear eyes look at what are the possibilities. Is there a way we can work this out so that we can stay together?
Yeah, having, and we'll make sure we link to this subreddit, the Fence Sitter subreddit, in the show notes of today's episode. But having examples like that, or there may even be examples in your life, or I know there's fantastic books on these topics. Of course, people who've come to different decisions. It's not to say it won't be painful, but I think if two people, as you say, are really polar opposites and neither one has any room within themselves to move, it's like, I can't imagine a happy life without becoming a parent, and vice versa. I cannot imagine having kids. If you find yourself in that boat, again, it sounds like there's, and what we're going to be talking about today is, of course, this flexibility in the middle, which I'm sure, so relieving for people to hear that there is a possibility of making it work. There are many different possibilities of making it work, and starting to explore what those different scenarios and sort of compromises, if you will, look like. Okay, maybe we don't have 3 children. Maybe we have 1. Maybe we don't have a kid now. Maybe we wait. Is there a way that we can incorporate children into our life in a different way and remain child free? But ultimately, if you are with someone who has very distinctly different wishes for life and they're clear on that, as much as it's hard, to be able to give one another the gift of honoring that, I think is super powerful. And it's so beautiful to hear that, that's the ultimate act of love, to be able to
It
say,
is.
yeah, you want something drastically different than me. And as much as it pains me, I want you to have that because I love you and you love me and want me to have what I want. So, okay, but if people are feeling like there's some tension there and one person wants something, the other person's leaning the other way, like you say, don't panic, don't freak out. I'm interested. So if we've got two people who are pretty ambivalent, even if, let's say, one of them's leaning one way, one's leaning the other,
Mhm.
do you generally suggest that they move forward talking about this, or should there be like a going away period where they do their own work and connect with what they want if they're not clear on what that is? How do you
Well, I
usually
think some
advise
of
that?
both. So I advise everyone to do the exercises called secret doors in the baby decision.
Mm.
I
Hmm.
want them to do those separately and then have conversations about what they find and what they learn. Because it's if you don't do the exercises at all, or if you do them with your partner present, you are not going to allow yourself to connect to the part of you that wants the opposite of what your partner wants. So
Yeah.
that's one important thing. Another thing is that doing all those exercises helps you talk to your partner. So someone who just says, "Oh, I want to be child free because I want freedom and travel, and look how much we love our backpacking, mountain climbing trips, et
Hmm.
cetera," may not really have been able to connect until doing these exercises with the fact that, I had a, a sibling who was 2 years younger than me who was very sick. And once he came into our lives, it was all about him, and my childhood ended. There can be things that you haven't thought about that these exercises
Yeah.
help you connect. And if you share that with your partner, they're going to be very loving and understand. That doesn't mean that you agree on the choice, but it helps you understand. For someone who says, "Oh, I want to have kids," well, everybody does it and you're good with kids. Look how good you are with kids when we're at parties and stuff. That's not enough. Doing these exercises, there can be things like, I have these fantasies of holding a baby and the 3 of us together on a sofa, listening to music and reading stories. Just there are a lot of different ways in which these exercises help people connect with memory, with sensory input, with wishes or ideas for the future. And so doing
Yeah.
these exercises on their own, they're really able to come together and share more deeply. And it makes it a lot easier to understand if your partner wants something different from you, if you understand not that just arbitrarily they said, oh, well, of course we want to travel, or of course we
Yeah.
want a child because everybody has one.
You know, part of what can happen is when we're grappling with this kids or child-free decision, we really start going in circles. We get stuck thinking the same things over and over again, sort of being in our well-worn ways. And it can be really hard to take our thinking and our decision-making in a fresh direction, to actually get new insight and to feel like we're making steps forward towards a path, whatever that may be. If you want to break out of that rut that you are in and to get some insight from someone who is not your partner or not your mom, not your best friend, somebody who can really be impartial in this decision and can ask you thoughtful questions and who can make observations about what they're hearing and what you're seeing as far as where you're stuck and what it is you want, you definitely want to check out my Clarity Booster offering. This is the most accessible way of working with me one-on-one. What it is we meet for a 1-hour coaching call where we're going to tackle a specific aspect of your kids or child-free decision, where you're feeling stuck. I'm going to ask you a bunch of thoughtful questions. And after that coaching session, I'm going to give you some specific takeaways and exercises for you to do on your own after our call. Then a couple weeks later, we're going to meet up for a 30-minute follow-up call where we're going to see what kind of traction you've made, where you're at, and where we go from there. If you're interested in checking out the Clarity Booster offering, it's only $349 plus taxes, so it really is the most affordable way of working with me one-on-one, of getting my eyes and ears on whatever it is you're grappling with. I'm going to include the details for the Clarity Booster in the show notes of today's episode, and you can also find those over at kidsorchildfree.com. Again, that's the Clarity Booster. I look forward to hopefully hosting you soon for one of these calls. Back to the show. Yeah. I was looking at the Secret Doors chapter of the book today, and there are just some fantastic questions in there and exercises to go through. And I think, you know, not only does it lend better understanding of your partner, but for yourself, and certainly if you're not in a partner situation, then and regardless, I think we want that self-knowledge. I know for me, and this might sound strange to people, but I actually continue to do this work and this exploration. And I have to say, looking at some of these questions again, as a person who's made the affirmative child-free choice, it really just sheds more light and understanding on why I've chosen what I have. And, you know, I like to encourage my clients, like, at a certain point, trying to figure out exactly why we are the way we are and why we want what we want or don't want, it can become, in a sense, I don't want to say futile, but it can feel like, okay, we can't possibly mine out every last bit of what's happened to us and what's created who we are. However, it can be really interesting. And sometimes I think for me, the further in some sense I get from that decision point, the more I start to realize, oh, wow, this experience I had really did help inform the way I feel. Oh, interesting. This is what I saw. No wonder I don't want that experience. So I agree. I think there's so
That's
much
great.
light to be shed there.
That's wonderful.
Okay. So sounds like then, you know, important to do these questions apart, important to come together and have these discussions. Important to get some outside counsel in the form of a coach, a psychotherapist, to be able to help you navigate some of these things. And like you say, to maybe help shed light on some blind spots. Do you mind just shedding or giving a little bit of clarity when you talk about maybe helping people see blind spots or things that they may not otherwise see? Can you give us an example of what that might be in a couple situation?
Sure. Okay. Well, one that comes to mind is sometimes couples are disagreeing about having a child and they're just not getting anywhere. They're going over the same thing over and
Mm,
over again. And then it may come out that one person doesn't want to commit to having a child because they don't fully trust their partner. They're not getting the kind of compassion and understanding and full attention and listening that they need from their partner. So there's already a problem of not
mhm.
connecting as deeply, an issue of attachment. And so sometimes couples will decide, well, we're going to work on a relationship and not even make the decision yet. And that can be fascinating because as they work on that, they may either decide to have a child and feel more comfortable with that decision and be much more prepared to stay connected to each other, even during the first difficult few years of a child, or they may be able to get more out of being child free because they've
Yeah.
connected with each other so deeply.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, it's why with my clients, and I'm sure, and I mean, from what I'm hearing in your own work as well, it's like we kind of have to set the stage, right? And look at the environment in which the circumstances in which we're making this decision. Because yes, it's about deciding whether or not to have kids or these 6 different orientations of this decision, but it's also about our broader lives. And a classic example is I've had people say to me before, well, things were going really well in my career. I was really fulfilled by it. And now I've maybe move companies or things have changed or I hit the big milestone at work. And suddenly they're asking themselves, okay, this isn't fulfilling me as much anymore. Now do I want a child? And of course, a child can be a very fulfilling thing, but that's also something we want to move towards very consciously rather than as a replacement because let's say we're unhappy in a relationship or at work or what have you, right? I think it's like
Right,
we want to
right.
be able to go in with eyes wide open and say, I'm choosing this deliberately for these reasons versus
Yes.
I'm trying to fill a gap or a hole in my life.
Right. And a child is one possibility, but it may not be the best possibility.
Totally.
One thing that can help sometimes when people are feeling stale and wanting to know what's more, and they think, well, child free will just mean remaining the same, is
Yeah.
that if you make that conscious decision, you have many opportunities to get more involved in things that you don't even know about yet, that you haven't
Yes.
discovered. You know, you may suddenly remember that you love studying French and decide as a child-free couple to take French together and plan some trips to France. One
Yeah.
thing that can be helpful is to ask, what did you love to do as a child and that you haven't done for years? That could
Mm.
be art, public speaking, writing, some kind of charity work, political action. So there are many ways to connect. And some people decide to be child free because they're already so involved with something, whether it's a career or some other kind of
Yeah.
mission or commitment, that they know that's one of the reasons they're deciding to be child free. But this is
Yeah.
really important because I work with people who say, well, if I don't have some burning alternative, is it okay to decide to be child free? And I say, you can make two decisions at a time. You can decide to be
Mm.
child free because you're ruling out parenthood and have the question, and you have time to find answers. And sometimes so much energy is going into deciding to be child free that you don't have the creativity or the energy or the calm or the curiosity to discover the things that you're
Yeah.
going to do next.
Yeah, so true. It takes up so much mental, emotional real estate and space to be grappling with this question. So it really does open up so many possibilities should you choose to embrace them. And of course, I also sometimes hear from people, well, what if I don't want things to change? Do I have to do something extra or great or next level or have a charitable project? And it's like, no, you can live your life how you want, but if you feel like there is something more that you feel called to or want to step towards, of course, that is more than available for you.
Yes, but that reminds me of something that I always say, which is as a child-free
Yeah.
person, you have a right to be ordinary. You don't have to do
Yes.
anything special to justify your existence in the world. But ironically, child-free people usually do extraordinary things. Just to decide to
Yeah.
be child-free in this day and age, even with more acceptance, you're still being a maverick. You're still taking risks. And usually you are involved or you become involved with something that really matters to you and not being
Yeah.
caught up in parenting and listening to and valuing yourself, it leads you to do wonderful things where you do make a mark. But the important thing here is it's not an obligation. You don't have to prove anything. And for people who are child free, the special things that they're doing, they do more easily, more joyfully, if they're just free to be ordinary.
Yeah. So true. There's a great irony in that, but I think there's a lot of truth in that. Okay, you heard it here first. If you haven't heard it before, if you choose child free, you can choose to be ordinary. And from the ordinary, you may become extraordinary. Who knows? If you want
Exactly.
to. I'm interested. So you're a mom of two. You've supported people with this work for a long time, but I'm really curious, like, how did you become such sort of a really beautiful advocate and a voice for the child-free path? Because you speak with it so passionately, and you've said that, you really seek to sort of represent and uplift child-free people. So how did that come to be, do you think?
I think that the fact that I considered being child free made me more aware of the good possibilities of being child free. And I think just
Mm,
being a social worker and being trained and just observing people around me, I
yeah.
realized that there were a lot of people who were child free and very happy where parenthood would not have worked well for them.
Yeah.
And I also was an advocate for single mothers by choice and for gay people, whether single or as couples, becoming parents. And I always said, you can't divide the world into piles and say everyone who is heterosexual should have a child, and everyone who's gay or single or married has to be child free.
Yeah.
What makes sense is, who am I as a person? If I'm in a relationship, how are we in a relationship? And does having a child appeal to us or not? So it's all
Yeah.
part of that reproductive freedom.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the work that you do and have done over the years. And I know you've, speaking of reproductive freedoms, maybe that's maybe a good question to explore. I'm curious how you feel this question of kids or child free has become. Does it feel more important, more pressing, more at risk of being taken from us with things going on? Especially, I'm based in Germany, but with what has been happening in the U.S. over the last couple of years, like how has that played a role in your work, if at all?
Okay, so first I just want to say that deciding whether or not to have a child is definitely harder now than it was 20 years
Mm,
ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago when I
okay.
was doing this work. There's so much worry about the environment. I think that that's really important. In terms of reproductive freedom and abortion, I'll come back to that in a minute. But also, there is so much concern about quality of life because it can be often hard to get childcare because, especially in the United States, there is no paternity or maternity leave.
Yeah.
And because finances are so difficult, it's harder to have a child. And some people who would like to have two or three kids are trying to figure out, can they even have one? So there are many, many different social factors going
Hmm.
on. And the struggle to maintain democracy in the world, of course, is another thing that concerns parents. So all of those things are making the
Yeah.
decision more difficult. In terms of the lack of availability of abortion for many people, this is very much a
Hmm.
part of people's decision making. Some people are moving out of states that have restricted abortion to live in other states,
Yeah.
particularly if want to have a pregnancy. They want to know that if there is a reason to terminate that pregnancy, that they will be able to do that. That the mother's health will not be at stake, the baby's health will not be at stake because of laws that are cruel and not taking into consideration what real
Yeah.
families, flesh and blood, need.
Yeah. Okay. I'm interested. Certainly some of the issues that you just touched upon are going to be they're becoming increasingly relevant and real pressing considerations for people, which I of course hear as well. What else has changed over these last 45 years of doing this work? I'm so curious because that's a pretty
Right,
good cross section of
right.
time. So what would you say you've observed or noticed, or what's
Okay,
changed for the way you approach things,
okay.
perhaps?
Okay, well, one thing that I'm really happy with is, even with all the pronatalism that still exists,
Yeah.
there's a lot more acceptance of child-free people than there used to be.
Mm,
And there's also more acceptance of single mothers by choice and more acceptance of gay people having children. So
mhm.
I think that those are all good things. Now, I
Yeah.
thought when I was raising my children that by the time my children were grown, if they chose to become mothers, I thought that there was going to be a lot changed that still hasn't changed. There's still not maternity and paternity leave for most people. There's still not accessible childcare. Couples really struggle, even if they want to be egalitarian. There was an article in the New York Times a few years ago about they started with a couple that had graduated from an Ivy League college and both were lawyers with equal talents and equal places in their careers. And once they had a child, they needed to make a decision because law firms were getting more demanding than they had previously been. So, in order to
Yeah.
advance and go toward partnership, someone was going to have to work 90 hours a week, and someone was going to have to be taking the child to childcare and so on. So, this issue of equity has not, in some ways, there's been improvement, and in
Mhm.
some ways, there has not. So that's a disappointment. Another thing that has really changed. So let me back up. So of course, we all know people can die in childbirth. And we know it
Yeah.
happened even more in the past when there was less medical care. So it's not new that women are afraid of dying in childbirth or going through pregnancy or of the postpartum period. But what has changed is I find that most younger women are obsessed with fear of pregnancy. They are almost
Interesting.
certain that their pregnancy is going to have complications. They're almost certain it's going to be a terrible childbirth and that childbirth may do something to their bodies so they'll never be normal again. Like they'll never be able to lose weight or they're going to pee in their pants forever and ever. Um, I think a lot of that has to do with the internet. I think hearing so many of the very, very worst stories, there's a kind of emotional contagion. We get so involved in those emotional stories that our creative imagination assumes it's going to happen to us, even though statistically it's very unlikely. So we're flushing our minds with the worst that can happen rather than realizing the good that will probably happen and that there's certain things you can take by the doctors that you find, childbirth education, and so on to make things go well. And the other piece I think is that millennials and Gen Zs have been in a generation where with recessions, they've been laid off. They may have high college loans. They may have jobs for which they are underqualified. And so there's a lot, and look at the political scene and look at the reproductive rights scene.
Yeah.
So there's so much that's out of their control that I think that this idea of I don't want to give up control of my body is so pronounced right now. Some women have worked years to lose weight, to deal with eating disorders. They're exercising, they're feeling good about their bodies. And the idea that they could do something that will completely change their bodies, even temporarily, is very difficult. So that's something that has changed in recent years.
Okay. And knowing, of course, these are all, separate issues that probably have various considerations to make. And of course, as you say, some concerns it's not that they're unfounded, but like you say, statistically low chances of certain issues occurring, for example. At the same time, they're not necessarily unfounded. We can look at, for example, like concerns with climate change and whatnot. So this is, of course, a broad question to address or tackle very specific, discrete sort of concerns, but how do you encourage someone to go about approaching these things that feel like they are outside of them and yet very much do impact them? Specifically when we look at the political landscape, or we look at reproductive justice, things that maybe feel like, they're impacting us, but it doesn't feel directly within our control.
That's a really tough question. I think that part of it is just looking at the situation in general, and it is acknowledging what one's fears are. And if people have very, very strong fears about pregnancy, or if they have very strong feelings about climate change, they may and do decide not to have a child, or they might decide to adopt. But a lot of times it's a matter of let's look at all of the factors. Some people decide, even though they're very committed to the environment, to have just one child. And they're very committed to working with their child to help the environment. I know there was just a political action that was done by children in Hawaii for the environment. I don't remember exactly what that was. There was another situation somewhere in the Northwest where children and parents and teachers worked together on a project in which a judge decided to forbid fracking. So there's some very concrete organizations, books, organizations of environmentalists with parents and teachers and so on. So that looking into all of these possibilities, some people can decide there are ways I can be active with the environment and still have a child. And then in terms of pregnancy, what I do is I say, and in fact, I'm doing this in my new book, let's identify everything that scares you about pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum. Let's see how big those factors are. Let's talk about how some people who were just as terrified as you went forward. What did they do? What did they learn about relaxation? What did they learn about planned cesareans? What did they learn about use of medication that was safe for the baby? What different aspects of the medical and the psychological and the spiritual enabled them to go forward? Or if you look at all those things and you have an idea of how that worked for other people, but you're saying, that doesn't matter. I know I don't want to do it. Well, you've ruled it out, but you can feel better about ruling out pregnancy if you look at it rather than just say, no, I can't do it. Because then there's always the
Yeah.
question, well, maybe I could, maybe I could. But looking at it carefully, seeing what are the steps that people take that can actually help them get through it. And does that seem like something you think you could do or not? And you can do a kind of, one step without deciding, committing to pregnancy, go and meet with an OBGYN who you think you might be comfortable with and talk about, avoiding pain and talk about avoiding childbirth and so on. And, see if these things are alleviating your anxiety or not. And then you can decide, no, I'm definitely never going to be pregnant, or I'm going to learn more, learn the relaxation techniques and so on, and see what happens.
I like that idea of being, sort of methodical, if you will, and also knowing, yes, to go back to your earlier point of the internet, and there's all this information, we hear horror stories, and we know all the possible things that can go wrong with having children and raising them, et cetera. There are also a myriad of solutions. So, as an example, we talk about, you say women who are afraid they're, going to pee their pants and you can't jump on the trampoline or sneeze, otherwise you're going to be incontinent. That's also something that is talked about so much more than it was, let's say, 1 or 2 generations ago. And we know now about things like pelvic floor therapy, or being able to go do Pilates training or what have you. We know that there's procedures that women can get done. We know there's things that they can do during pregnancy to help hopefully prevent these things. So it's not to dismiss the reality of some of those challenges, but there also are solutions. And I want to refer people, if you do have fear around pregnancy, I have to say, episode 1 of the podcast with Desiree Nielsen, who's a friend of mine, she did hypnobirthing with both of her children. And again, to your point, this may not be the approach for everyone, but I have to say, as someone who has chosen not to have children, but hearing about her experience of going through having 2 hypnobirths and just how incredible these birthing experiences were, all it made me think is, if I ever had a child, I would certainly at least explore doing things that way, why not? So, and I love what you say too, as much as we of course tend to center ourselves when we have anxiety, when we feel stuck, you're not the first one who's grappled with this, right? You're not the only person who was afraid to give birth, the only person who was worried about struggling through postpartum. There are others who've gone before you, and we can learn through them and from them. You mentioned something about only children a second ago, or a few minutes ago. And I heard you speaking on, it was the Liz Moody podcast. You were on it, gosh, at least a few months ago. It might've been a year ago now, but it was a great conversation you had with her. And you spent quite a bit of time focusing on something that I thought, wow, this is something I so seldom hear people talk about. And even when we explore this question, do I want to have kids, plural, or stay child-free, we very seldom entertain the notion that we can have one child. And so I don't want to say you made a case for having a single child, but effectively you did. And so can you just share, why people, if they're on the fence, they might consider having one child?
Okay, well, there are a whole bunch of reasons. I'm going to back up and say, when I used to do a lot of workshops on this topic, one of the first things I said in the first 5 minutes of the workshop is, don't decide between 0 and 2. You've never been a parent. You don't know whether you're going to like parenthood. You don't know whether you're going to like your child. Why make the decision harder by assuming you have to have a second child? You are free to have just one child. There are many myths. In my Instagram right now, I'm doing a whole series on myths about only children. There's a lot of belief that only children are spoiled, that they're lonely, that they don't know how to get along with people, and so on. But actually, only children are, by research studies, are more popular and better liked than the rest of us. They really enjoy independence. Most adult onlys say they really liked everything about their childhood, with the exception of wanting to know how to take care of their elderly parents. And I actually have an Instagram post on that particular issue. But for many people, the only child is the best solution. If you're worried about the environment, if you financially are struggling, if both members of the couple are really involved in their careers, and in addition or instead of are involved in the arts or starting a small business, they will describe one child as the best of both worlds. They get to experience the joys of parenthood, but not being so overwhelmed as they would by a second child. If you love to travel, by the time your only child is 3, you can take them on most trips. And again, Reddit Fence Sitter is full of stories of people talking about traveling with their kids, and it's especially easy with one. Let's say
Yeah.
you go to a museum and you have two kids. It's likely that at least one of them is going to be hungry or cry, or that they're going to fight with each other. If you have one child, if there's a problem, you can probably quickly take care of it. So going out into the world as a family of three is a lot easier. So there are a lot of good reasons.
Yeah, and if I hadn't made my decision, I mean, you sort of sell me on the notion of one child. And I like that you debunk a lot of the negative associations or stereotypes we have with that, because I remember there was a point where we were, I don't want to say advanced age, but Chris and I had been together for quite some time at this point. We were approaching our mid-late 30s. And I said, if we have a child now, it will be probably a child. I can't see at this stage having multiple children. And Chris had actually a bit of pushback around that based on some of these notions of what it means to have an only child, that you're not providing them with this companionship and that only children are spoiled, etc. So I will both link to your Instagram so people can check out those myths that you bust.
Great.
We'll also link to the Liz Moody podcast episode, because
Wonderful.
I'm all for let's just share as many conversations on these topics, this decision, as possible. But I think it's worth some food for thought. And like you say, at the very least, if you're considering this decision, which if you're listening, there's a good chance you are, take a look first at kid or child free. Do I want to have a child or remain child free? Should you decide to have a child and that goes well and you're successful and you enjoy it, then you can consider having a second or third. But I think it's I don't want to say it lowers the stakes, but hopefully it will help make this feel a little bit less daunting than
Yes.
I'm going to go breed
Yes.
and have 12 children. Something that you shared with me, and I have to agree with you because, well, I had a recent podcast guest on which spoke to this, but you said that this decision has a tendency to sort of poke at people's mortality, if you will. My words, not yours, but it stirs up a lot of big questions for people. And I'm curious if you can give voice to that. I know I've shared sort of my perspective and I agree with you, but why do you say that the kids are child-free decision does that?
Because I think that a lot of times when people are stuck on this decision, there's a shadow of mortality and they're not aware of it. To be child-free means acknowledging that you're going to die without having a child. Even to decide to have a child, you're risking the possibility of death in pregnancy. You're risking the possibility that you may die before your child or children are grown. You're acknowledging in a way that your child is going to outlive you. So I think there's always a shadow of death. And by having it unspoken, a lot of times that really gets in the way of decision making. One of the reasons we don't want to make either choice is we don't want to give anything up. And if we've been clever and worked hard for what we want, we may have had a lot of control over our lives up until this. So sometimes just acknowledging, you're going to die at X point in time, and you're going to need to decide, are you going to be a parent or not? How are you going to deal with this? Just looking at the fear of death, talking about it, can make it easier to make the choice. So I think that is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think this question, it brings up big philosophical questions on life. Like, what is this all for? And what do I value? And, what is a well-lived life? And that's why it's so powerful to explore this question. That's why it's a beautiful opportunity. But that's also what makes it, I think, extra tricky for people. And to your point, even if it's not conscious, I think it kind of stirs up something within us where we're like, whoa, this is, we obviously know it's not what am I going to have for dinner tonight, but it's a big question, and that it touches on our entire life, and it makes us, it forces us to think about the end of our life as well.
No, it is really possible to feel a certain foundation when you accept death and say, okay, given that my years are numbered, how do I want to spend them? It's also true. I have an Instagram post, 38 is great. If people have a child at 38, they've had 20 years of being an adult. You could also talk about this is best of both worlds, and then they become parents. So that is a way of enjoying a lot of child-free life before becoming a parent. So that is one way that people try to have it all. And, I'm just also going to, talk about how death affects me. I'm 75 years old. And one of the things that's been so great for me about writing a new book and the conversations that I have online is that I'm able to share the things I've learned through all these years with newer generations that are making this decision. And also, I want to tell listeners that Keltie is a part of this because Keltie is doing consultation with me. I'm mentoring her among a few other people. I'm teaching younger people who like my approach some of the principles of what I do so that they can carry that on when I'm no longer here. I'm blessed with good health, but I'm also mortal. So I think just, in suggesting that the listeners look at mortality, I think it's only fair that I mention how I'm dealing with my own mortality.
Yeah, I mean, certainly you're a gift for us to have here, and you will leave such an incredible legacy with us through all of the work that you do. And it's an honor to be both working with you and to have you sharing everything that you've learned and continue to learn. And I'm really excited for the new book as well, and for you to be able to touch on some of these. I don't want to say more relevant points because certainly it's all relevant, but I think what feels very pressing and also unique to what we are facing today in terms of some of the various world events and pressures, et cetera. So
yeah, an important part of our work is listening. So not just looking at parent decision making in general, but what are flesh and blood people that you and I are coaching? What are they saying? What are their questions? And how do we adapt our interventions with them to address their deepest longings and fears?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's interesting. It's unique. I mean, some of the questions or concerns that perhaps you would assume are more pressing aren't. Even the fear of childbirth is one. I hear it. I don't hear it as often as perhaps you're hearing it. But that just kind of. I think there's seasons, right, in our business and the types of clients we talk to, and I think sometimes it gives us an opportunity to be able to really explore and delve into something where you're thinking, okay, this keeps coming up again and again and again. I think this line of work, I can tell you already, being still in early days, that it will never cease to I don't want to say entertain me, not to say people's challenges entertain me, but I will always be learning.
You'll never be
I'm not
bored.
going to tire of it. No, this is what I want to say. This is what I say. I will not be bored. Certainly not. And by the way,
I also wanted to add, we are very blessed that people share their lives with us when we coach them. It is such an honor for people to trust us enough.
Yeah.
To share their dilemmas and their fears and their longings.
Yeah. And it feels, and I know you feel the same way, it feels so meaningful to be doing this. And the question of whether or not to have kids is obviously super important. And, it's this big, momentous, life-changing decision. And yet I see the work we do as extending even beyond that. It's really asking people and helping people figure out how they want to live, how they want to be here in this world, what they want to contribute, to help them answer these big philosophical questions that they have. So yeah, it's certainly an honor. And I just, as a sidebar, want to point people, because I referenced it, but I didn't fully reference, if on the topic of death, if you want to get a little more comfort with this topic, because I know some people, it kind of raises their hackles. They don't love talking about it. I actually kind of like talking about death, but that's morbid old me. Check out episode 21, I believe it is, of the Kids Are Childfree podcast with hospice nurse Julie. She's fantastic, as well as her book. So I'll give a little shout out to that conversation. Okay, so before we wrap up, I'm curious now, you mentioned you're 75 years old. Your children are presumably grown. They are grown adults now. I'm interested if you can give us like a little bit of the long view on parenting, because I feel like a lot of the parents we've had on so far, they've tended to have, not entirely so, but for the most part, they've had younger children. So what's it like being a parent of people who've flown the nest and are out doing their own thing?
Well, I guess I would say my perspective is that I have enjoyed parenting, and that it's really interesting to see how children grow and change. I especially enjoyed when they were in their late teens and early 20s, seeing them develop their interests and form love relationships and form lifelong friendships, and really just kind of find out who they are.
Yeah.
And they're both at really interesting places right now. My daughter, Marcella, who has been a reporter for many years, just got a contract to write a book about community colleges as the best opportunity for social mobility for young people to get into the middle class who are low income or have other other issues. And it's just beautiful to see how she is, developed and is,
Yeah.
on the cusp of that,
So
as well as
cool.
raising a 10-year-old and, being in a good marriage. And I see the advantages of her one and done child
Yeah.
experience. And my daughter, Vanessa, actually has just gotten some coach training and is another person in addition to you, Keltie, who is interested in carrying on my work. Something I never anticipated because she's been and still is involved
Yeah.
in theater and fundraising and not someone who's looked to this kind of work. But it's been really lovely to see how they've changed and evolved as human beings.
Yeah.
And I think for people who are thinking, oh, I don't really want a baby, to realize they're only going to be a baby for a couple of years. And some people do actually enjoy the baby phase most.
Yeah.
But, it wasn't always easy. There were certainly moments that I thought, what have I gotten myself into? But I'm certainly glad that I had a child. But I will also acknowledge, I think I could have had a good life as a child-free person,
Yeah.
and that would have been a different life, and that
Yeah.
there would have been good things about that as well.
I think it's such a great perspective to have. And I know I feel the same way myself, that I think parenting would have offered different kinds of rewards and experiences and challenges, and it would have been a different life. And perhaps, at this stage of my life, I see that it probably wasn't quite as well suited for me as the path I've chosen. But
Mhm,
I
mhm.
do think, and I've spoken about this before, that part of what gave me the freedom to make that decision that felt right for me based on what I know and where I am right now was really not just intellectually knowing it, but actually believing that both decisions could lead to a really beautiful, fulfilled life. I think that gave a lot of freedom and sort of spaciousness to feel like, okay, now I can decide, now that there feels like there's less pressure to make that perfect right choice.
And I think that's been your real gift to the world, that you experienced that and that you were motivated to help other people make the decision.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Merle. Well, we are going to wrap things up, and you are not immune like everyone else. You have to go through the rapid fire questions. So I'm going to bring them up here. 5 questions. First two are finish the sentence. Okay. So being a mom is
A fascinating and challenging experience.
being a mom is not.
Always easy.
All right. What is one tool or resource that you think would help people with this decision?
I think that curiosity is the best resource. My books and my coaching and therapy, we use a lot of different decision making tools, which you will find online and in the book. But I think the most basic one is curiosity. I think if you are curious about the future and you realize that you don't know everything and you're willing to be uncertain and willing to learn, that this process can be quite wonderful despite the pain.
Yeah, that's such a good answer. And I don't think anybody has ever said curiosity. So I really like that. Okay, what is one thing that you would like child-free people to know?
I would like child-free people to know that they are brave heroes and heroines and pioneers. And that from my perspective, having done this work for so many years, despite the continuing horrors of pronatalism, things are improving in terms of the general public understanding and respecting child-free people.
Amen. All right, and lastly, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether to have kids or stay child-free, what would that piece of advice be?
It would be to take a deep breath, not assume that you need to know all the answers right now. Well, and to trust yourself that even though you don't have an answer and you're impatient to have an answer, that you have the skills inside you to find an answer.
Thank you. All right, as we wrap things up, where can people find you? What do they need to know? How can they make sure they get their hands on the new book and the current book? Tell us all the things.
Okay. Well, my website, thebabydecision.com, is a source for people to read a lot of blog posts. And it's also a place where you can subscribe to my newsletter, which comes out a few times a year. Currently in the newsletter for subscribers only, there are excerpts of the new book, which I believe is going to be called Baby or Child Free. I can be found on Instagram at the Baby Decision. To find me on Facebook and to join my private Facebook group, I don't have. There are too many numbers in the.
That's okay.
I'll,
We'll link
I'll have
it.
to.
We'll link it in the show notes.
I'll give
All
it
of
to
it.
you.
Yeah.
Um, So, yeah. And so, I mean, those are the basic places to find me. I do participate in Fence Sitter.
Perfect. Okay, well, head to the show notes, check out the Baby Decision website, find Merle all the places. We'll make sure to link to them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know
Oh,
this
I will.
Yeah.
Okay,
Go
I don't
ahead.
know whether you would put this in, but I would say that I see people all over the world, and that's one thing that's changed in the 45 years is I have the technology now to talk to people on the other side of the earth, and I love it. And I really get to learn about different cultures and how people approach parenting and child free in different languages and cultures and other sides of the world.
Amazing. So no matter where people are listening from, and we've got people from, gosh, I think about 200 countries now, they can connect with you and work with you. Amazing. Gotta love the internet for all of its pitfalls. There's good things about it. Thank you for coming on today, Merle. It was such an honor to speak with you. I know this conversation is going to have inspired and helped so many people. And yeah, it's just very much an honor to have connected with you.
Well, I'm honored to be here, and I love your work, and I'm learning from you as well. So I'm just very glad you're in the world and doing your excellent, creative, compassionate work.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That concludes another episode of the Kids Are Child Free podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's conversation. Now, if you have not already done so, first of all, I want you to give us a follow over on Instagram. Our handle is @KidsOrChildFree. Otherwise, I will link to that in the show notes. And what I would love for you to do is to slide on into my DMs and let me know who would you like to hear on the podcast as an upcoming guest. This can either be someone in particular that you would love for me to have a conversation with, or maybe it's a certain type of guest. There's somebody in particular that you are wanting to hear from, whether that be, hey, Keltie, I want to hear from somebody who had kids later in life, or I want to hear from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma, or whatever it may be. Let me know who you want to hear from, who would be an ideal guest, and I will do my very best to get them onto the podcast for a future episode.